Hi, everybody. Welcome to this series of focusing conversations through which you will get to know the extraordinary members of our online forest training program. I'm so pleased to include you via these videos in our exciting and timely project of using Genlin's focusing to empower community life.
So I think the essence of what we wanted to capture and what I was so moved by when we were talking, it was either I guess we had just had our election, or had our election. We're in the States, and we're waiting to and everyone was on pins and needles. And you said something, and unfortunately, we didn't have it recorded. But it was something about listening and conflict, and there was something also that you said just about however you're all feeling and however divided the country is, some million amount of you voted. And that was so moving to me. In particular, it gave me some sort of sense of us as a whole. And then you spoke also about Ireland and the conflict, and how talking and listening, not talking, really listening, was so important.
But what I found most uplifting was people's actual ownership of their vote, the tremendous effort that people took with the presence of the coronavirus and the risks that it brought, that they were going to access and ensure that their vote was counted through the menu of options that were provided, be it the postal vote, through the early voting in the different states. And I think for someone looking in from the outside and observing from another country, to see lines and lines of people queue so respectfully and for hours to vote, regardless of the side that they were voting for, that for me at that stage wasn't so much the essence of it. The essence was that this was democracy alive, and people were choosing to get up and have their voice and their vote counted. To the point at that stage, I think, of that night when we had our meeting, I think at that stage, 72 million people had voted. And even within the 72 million, it was so close, it was too close to call. But it was the fact that it was democracy in action. And America has always been a beacon for democracy across the world. I mean, people have looked to the States as that beacon of democracy. And I think it was very evident that it was actually happening, that people in their own lives were owning this, that people were getting up and creating the space for this. And that came from some place, that something inside of people that wanted to be heard, that wanted that to be expressed and wanted to make a difference. And at that stage, you had people coming from both sides, because both sides have their view and both sides have their sense of where, at that stage, they wanted the country to either continue to go or the possibility of a different and new direction. And no violence, no corruption, and happening in a peaceful and democratic way. And I think one can't underestimate the power of that. I think that's really important to say, looking in from the outside, that that's what the heart of democracy is about, regardless at that stage of the outcome, because people didn't know the outcome. And people didn't know, even with those long queues, were they for the current incumbent or were they for the challenger, Mr. Biden? Nobody knew which side they were, other than every day there was droves of people out to exercise their right. And it
So
transpires now that between both sides, like when you think of it, what's it, 158 million people voted in your country?
something about the process was, as much as the being in the US, I have not felt uplifted about my fellow Americans, about democracy. But what you're really pointing to beautifully is that the process was sort of bigger, like the principles bigger than the personalities. There
Well,
was this adherence to, we are going to vote and exercise our right, and we will stand here politely to do so. That's democracy, whomever is being voted for.
at that stage, it's beyond a political party and an ideology. It's about in each individual citizen in your country getting up and exercising their right to vote. In Ireland, people died for the cause of the vote. People fought because we were a nation that was ruled by Great Britain. We fought for our independence. We had a civil war. People died for the right to vote in Ireland.
To be heard is that important, to have a voice.
Absolutely. And I think it's that individual ownership of that to go out and exercise that right that is your right as a citizen, and to go through that process and to turn up day in, day out in numbers that you've never seen in your country.
Mm.
It's that individual ownership of that comes from somewhere deep within a person's choices, from that inside place. And something was stirred in people within that inside place to arise and go and say, right, I may have not voted the last time. I may have never voted. I may be new to voting, but I am damn well going out and going to exercise my right because this is too important. That something within the civic and civilness, the civil law of your country recognise within people, within the fabric of all age groups, that this is really a fundamental election.
There's something else that I think that you're pointing to about how essential, almost like needing to eat or be nourished, it is to be heard and to have a voice that it's worth dying for if you are not seen or not heard. And that's fundamental, and I think has to do partly with force and focusing, how critical it is to have the space and the process and the making a space where people can be heard and hear one another. You were talking about Ireland and the conflict and how something had unfolded over many, many years about listening. And there was sort of a refusal not to listen. The powers who were finally in charge, they would get so far and it would break down and they'd say, well, come back and listen some more.
I remember going to school in Ireland in the 80s as a young teenage boy, and Ireland was on a knife edge of possible implosion of civil war again in our country. I mean, you had Northern Ireland, where there was bombings and killings and shootings and retaliations from both the Catholic and Protestant communities. You had IRA prisoners in prison and on hunger strike. And the symbolism of recognizing that in the Republic where I lived was people were hanging black flags out of their houses as a silent acknowledgement, we are with you. But you could feel that tension as a young person cycling on your bicycle to school. You'd feel it inside you and you knew it was scary. But we also realized, political parties realized, people realized through the loss of loved ones and huge pain and conflict, that it was going nowhere. It wasn't the war, and this so-called fight for justice wasn't working through the war and violence. It wasn't actually achieving the goals other than hardship and pain. And we had the great foresight of a great leader in Northern Ireland, who was John Hume, who has since passed away this year, who began to dialogue in private and talk to the leaders of the Republican parties. And he held his conviction that he needed to enter dialogue and listen. And that was the starting point, that something had to change, and it could only come by listening and beginning to understand even each side within the Catholic and nationalist tradition, never mind moving over to the Protestant and Ulster tradition, that we needed to start within both sides beginning to listen within themselves and then to either side. And I mean, I think, and I remember at the time that John Hume was absolutely destroyed in the media for doing this, because at that stage, it was considered an absolute anathema to cross that bridge, and how could anyone talk to terrorists? And his line was, well, if we don't talk to terrorists, how are we going to find a way forward to convince them that democracy is the way and violence is not working? And he didn't give up. And they dialogued and dialogued and dialogued, till eventually then America became involved through your former president, Bill Clinton, who took major risks by giving the Republican leaderships visas, where it was actually, what the hell is going on here? This is just crazy, because it was beginning to step outside the box, because working inside the box doesn't work in these situations. And then he appointed, who I would consider in following it very closely, a senator with an amazing capacity to listen to all sides, and that was Senator George Mitchell. And that was the beginning of a long, long process of listening and challenging both sides and all sides, that they needed to hear each other and find compromise. And it's called, we eventually ended up with a power sharing initiative called the Good Friday Agreement, but it's a power sharing initiative. Not one side dominates over the other. Every party in Northern Ireland that wins its seats gets a representation in their parliament, and they share power together, and they all get ministries. It was a most ingenious idea. But it came from the essence of listening, and then going back and challenging sides that, well, you've moved so far, but you haven't moved enough. Or you need to jump more, or challenging the other side. No, you need to go back and convince the other side you've got as much as you're going to get. Like, it was back and forth dialogue. But we also had leaders that realized it had to change, because there was a generation of just bleakness ahead. Like, when I was growing up, it was called the Troubles. And when the word Troubles was mentioned, I immediately knew it meant violence. It would come in on the 6 o'clock news in my home most evenings, what would be happening, or there might be a break for a little while and then another explosion or another bomb or another. It would come into your sitting room, it would come into your living room. It was part of, my daughter is 13 years of age. When I mention the word trouble, she doesn't even cog what that means. So there's a generation of children now that have grown up and have no concept of what the word trouble means, that I had as a child and a young person. And that's the gift of what that peace process has given us. But that's the ultimate gift of all sides listening to try and find a way forward. And that's equally not saying either that it's rosy in the garden. It still breaks down, and the power sharing can be suspended, and there's difficulties and there's rows and there are arguments. But we haven't reverted back to the violence. We keep going back to listening and trying to find a way forward. It's about listening to deeply understand the other side, but it's also to deeply understand the fears, but also the desires and hopes. Because when you really sit down and think about it, most mums and dads, most nannies and granddads just want their children to grow up and be happy and to live in a peaceful world, and want to know when their children go to school that they're safe and there's not going to be a bomb that explodes or a tragedy.
Mhm.
And people have got used to peace now, and they won't go back to that. And I think it only came, and there's only one way it can come, and that's through listening to all sides, and then having to find compromise in that, and finding what's livable for each community. Like, one of the things that was in in our constitution in the Republic of Ireland was we lay claim to Northern Ireland and the 6 counties. It was, we put it in our constitution, it belonged to us. That was deeply offensive to the unionist community, who believed that they belonged to the British government and to the British system. So when the referendum came around, it was put to a referendum to the Irish people to give up that in our constitution and enshrine that we can only ever have a united Ireland through consensus from all sides.
Mm.
And after negotiations, it was put to a vote of the people, and it was a 95% vote in favour of amending those articles and removing them from our constitution. And again, there was great debate and listening prior to that vote, that this is part of us all coming together, and again, through democracy and voting, exercising our voice and being heard and choosing the road of peace in our country. I mean, I think, but it all stems from the process of listening.
I guess the term that comes is like radical listening, or a kind of commitment to listening, like you were talking about with John Hume, and this insistence on listening. And in law, in this country anyway, we have zealous advocacy, but we don't have a term zealous listening, or we have a commitment to zealously advocate, which to me, I have a connotation that it's to kind of pound your point as aggressively as possible. It's more a going out, a speaking, not to let me really hear from, even from my client or from the other party, what's really happening. And if the training was more that, and that was more what was needed, it's a different world instead of a.
When you actually truly listen to someone and you hear their story, it doesn't mean you're in agreement with it and you have to believe and believe, not so much accept, but take on board all of the essence of that truth for you and totally accept it.
Mm-hmm.
There are truths within that, but you need to hear those truths to actually sit with those truths.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same on the other side, back between communities. I think that's the essence of what needs to be heard. And then there will always be differences. How do you find that compromise then in the middle space, out of listening to both sides? How can both sides gain something and not lose face, but also begin to understand each other? That's the difference. That's the essence of what it should be about. Because you will always have polar opposites in the world. As sure as there's conservatives, there will also be liberals. I mean, it's just fact. I mean, no more than night follows day. That's how it goes, and there'll always be political diversions and political extremes that are there. And what worries me most is anyone that comes from a sense of fundamentalism on either side concerns me, because that's when I feel it's dangerous. That's when I feel then it's more like what you said, a pounding of and a placing out, and this is the way it is and this is the way it has to be. And to me, that's not healthy. To me, there's something about that that's off.
It's frightening in a way, because it's like only listening to one channel or only being tuned to one frequency. And there's something inherently almost unnatural about it. It's like a deciding to only see by kind of looking in some skewed way. And that's the only way. There's just an inflexibility.
Because everything has shades of gray. We're not black and white. Life is not black and white in terms of it's either black or it's white. There's many, many shades of gray in the middle of as to why people even arrive to the positions that they hold in their lives, shaped by their lived experiences. And that doesn't mean that these people are inherently any different than us. We are all human. It's those experiences that shape us in the direction of holding those views. It comes from that living experience of our life and how we're shaped. I mean, for someone that works in, for example, if I use an example, is someone that works in child protection, it's very clear when a child is nurtured and loved in a creative space, how they can reach that potential that's there. But if a child is in an abusive, controlling, coercive environment, their trajectory of life is sent in a different direction compared to the child that's in a more nurtured, loving environment. But those children then become adults, and those children are shaped by those experiences and then create their own views and insights and even political views out of that experience that they've experienced. So when we're even looking at a political sense, I think it's also shaped by our lived experiences. How can it not be?
Something you touched on a few minutes ago about how it can be so threatening to listen, to fully listen, because whether there's a belief or there's almost a bodily sense that, if I hear that, I might take it on, or I might be overcome by it, or that might be my belief now, and how will I hold? And it seems like there's something, a new way of listening, a different way of listening that has something more to do with really being able to hear what that particular being is communicating, rather than listening for sort of the truth of the matter or the correctness, but more, what is this that we're seeing? What is this that we're hearing? Kind of, what is this song or this poem? As opposed to so literally the position or the truth or something else that it seems to be like our default when we're listening to another.
I think this is where the process comes in, and I think this is where Jean Gendelin's process comes in, and I think this is the dimension that it offers us in listening, is that we can be truly present to another human being as another human being, and we all know how to do that. And whatever is unfolded and shared in that space and listening to another, it belongs also to that other being. It doesn't belong to me, but it doesn't mean I can't be present to it. It doesn't mean that it won't touch me or stir a stirring in me or arise a something in me, because that's what happens in our interactions. And that's okay, because I also have that process to take care of those parts in myself. And equally, just because I hold that listening space and I'm present to another, doesn't mean I'm taking ownership of their views and their values as mine. They're also separate. And that's okay. But it may awaken something in me that also may be healthy for me to re-examine myself. Actually, maybe I didn't see it quite like that. Or maybe there's elements of that I might need to reflect on. Because I think in our interactions, can't but touch and stir something in each of us. And I think I'm becoming more conscious of our presence then with each other is so important as well. It even goes way beyond even listening. It goes into that human presence with each other. And I have choices in that presence. I can choose to be reactionary and get into a condemning dialogue of, oh my God, how in the name of God could you have that opinion? What sort of planet are you on? Where are you coming from? Or can I come from the space of, wow, I didn't quite know you saw it like that. Can I get a sense of, actually, that's what that person feels, and that may rock me to my core, because it may be something that I completely did not expect this person to say. Mm-hmm. But that's only a part of that person. That person is also so much more than that. Mm-hmm. Like when you think of politics, one of the things that amazes me about American politics is people are very open about the Biden, Harris, and Trump Pence signs in their gardens, even next door neighbors, opposites. You won't get that in Ireland. People are very private.
Isn't that funny? I feel very private about it as well. And even being an American, and I'm accustomed to seeing it, but I feel quite private about religion in a way, except with people I know. I would not want people to know my religion by looking at some decoration on my house or some pronouncement of my ideology.
What I've learned now is that that's only one part of that person's personality, beliefs, and core. They're also way more than that. If we're to look at it from the lens of Genius philosophy, that's just an aspect of that person. They are way more than all of that. Deep down in the fabric of their being, there is way more inside that person. And do I choose to allow that political view that may be different to mine stop me and block me from connecting to the more of that person? Can I get beyond that? Can I get to know the human being under that may have very sincere and genuine sense of why they hold that belief because of their lived experience that I yet do not know, that I yet may discover if I'm curious enough to be open to it? And will that then change my whole lens of understanding? I actually chose to watch a number of documentaries afterwards about, Van Jones, that journalist on CNN, an African American, trying to understand, well, why did people vote for Trump? And he did an amazing documentary on it. And people actually voted because they actually felt left behind. They felt forgotten about. They felt nobody cares.
Unheard.
And then my lens began to change. And then I began to see all these deserted industrial sites that used to be harbors of work and labor and, a way of facilitating lives in different areas all across America in different states, gone, deserted and empty. And then when you sit with that, then my lens changed of how I actually saw those voters. They voted for something that was very important to them in their lives about being heard and not left behind. So I think it's about, can you see below that? Can you see below the initial, oh my God, Trump is there, he's in power, he's become the president. But what was really underneath people voting for him? What was the deeper meaning? And maybe voted out of hoping that would be different. And if you follow some of the documentaries that look at that, who of us as human beings don't hold that hope? I certainly hold that hope. I have voted for different political parties in Ireland in the hope that it will be different in each election. I don't necessarily hold with all of their political beliefs as a party, but I wanted to give another opportunity to someone else to try it different. Didn't work out, but I tried it, and I wouldn't vote for them again. But I took a chance. But it was still that it was based on wanting and a hopes as well. And I think that's the challenge ahead, is to understand that actually there are deeper reasons to why people may have come out and voted so strongly on either side, because each side holds that.
It goes back to how fundamental, how critical, and the consequences when people are not listened to and don't feel represented. So having your vote count, to know that your voice, there's something about existing, even if it's just one little voice among millions, that I'm here and I'm heard.
The night that President Biden-elect gave his talk, his acceptance speech of the outcome of the election, and Senator Harris was there, I looked at a lot of Black African women standing there in the cars, tears running down their faces, embracing each other. I seen young girls and women, and you're thinking, this is again a new dawn of new beginnings, of a message being sent out, and this is what people have chosen. And you see the significance of it for those African women that were standing there crying. There was decades of a history of a story of what that meant to them and their and I think
centuries even.
Absolutely. We carry our ancestors in us. I don't care what anyone says. Our ancestors are part of us, handed down to us from generations past. And as society evolves, it moves in different directions. But it fundamentally comes back to actually people having that respect to actually hold that presence and listen to all sides. Because I think what worries me about the world is that a lot of sides are becoming more entrenched and holding very polarized positions and not prepared to meet in the middle and find compromise. There's less and less politicians prepared to do that. And you'll see that across the world, not just America. You'll see it's become very polarized politics across the world. And that's not healthy, because there's an essence of truth in all sides of what they're looking for. It just, I don't think we're meeting enough halfway to get those connections and getting, because all sides have the positive and negative. And if you could get a bit of positive of all the sides in the one pot, where there's some sort of coming together and a becoming of something new, that's what each country needs. And each generation brings its own vision of that. And I think the generation in Ireland, I've seen it here. We've had a referendum on, gay marriage and the acceptance of it. You see the young people taking over and taking leadership on that. You see people standing up for rights and stuff. And as it evolves and moves forwards, each generation will take that step further. It's wonderful. And it's wonderful to see that. And it's wonderful. And it was wonderful for me to be here, because my daughter knows my interest in politics, to be actually say, isn't it amazing to see so many people, that 57, 58 million people went out and voted. That regardless of the result, that actually that amount of people got up and exercised their voice and are saying, we want to be heard, we want to be listened to. And now the challenge is, how do you bring the sides together? That's the biggest challenge ahead, because something has to change. It can't keep going the way it's going in your country, because it's not healthy. It's sowing seeds of division will only rip the nation apart. We've seen it here in Ireland. We've gone through it.
Something hopeful about, with everything feeling so ripped asunder and polarized in the country, that the process, that there was something very healing. And for me personally, hearing someone who is not in the country, someone who's not a US citizen, who's Irish, who's coming to us from Ireland, looking, with that perspective, to say democracy is still alive in your country.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think I've even followed it since, and I followed it very, very closely. I suppose the strategy to undermine it, and what I would feel very confident about in terms of your democracy is that strategy didn't work. But not only that, but within your democracy, I think, which is good as well, is that, within the cogs of your democracy and the court system, it couldn't be conned, it couldn't be fooled. And I think that's very important for the bedding down of your democracy, that actually this is solid, that there is a process that's happened, and this process has been fair, and that there has been no sign of corruption, and it has been monitored very closely. And I think that's really a very optimistic sign for the future. And I think also as well, I think something that I think is really important, and I think we don't emphasize it enough, is the wisdom of the elder politician. Like my icon of a politician has been Nelson Mandela. I mean, what that man went through and what he led and his leadership. Now, if you take Joe Biden, for example, president-elect, that man oozes compassion. But that man oozes compassion because of his lived experience. That man knows the pain of loss. That man knows the pain of grief. That man has journeyed inside himself, and that is very evident. You cannot reach the decisions, and you cannot have the presence that he has unless he has gone through a process within himself. Which it was, someone looking in from the outside was astounded to see at the night of his acceptance speech, he had the ability to stand back and allow his vice president have a limelight. That says an awful lot about how comfortable he has to be in his own skin, that he didn't feel threatened. That I can stand back and allow that, and allow and recognize the significance of that. And I think the world needs a lot of elder politicians to lead us as well, because I think they have a lot of wisdom that a lot of younger politicians just don't have. A lot of prime ministers that are in their 40s and 50s don't have the wisdom that the likes of guys that are in their 70s and coming up to 80. I know people challenge that, but I think your country needs that wisdom now.
Yes.
I think because it's also coming from a life of lived experience and also an understanding of hardship and pain and loss. The ability to reach out will come from that place. How it's received, you won't know, but I've no doubt this president will reach out. I've no doubt about that. How it's received is a different day's work. But the capacity to do that and reach out exists. That's the difference. The same capacity was here in Ireland. People reached out. It was received on all sides, but someone had to have the capacity to do it. John Hume had the capacity and the courage to do it. That's what started the revolution of a journey towards peace in our country. And it's that capacity that's really important. And then it's that capacity in your local community, with your neighbor, with your friend, with it's having that capacity to reach out and understand all sides. I think that's also important in the reaching out and the listening. It goes hand in hand. That would be my sense. And one must always hold hope. Like I often wonder if my grandfather was alive here in Ireland today, what he would feel, because I would say he would have thought it would never be possible. And that peace would be in Ireland. And here I am, his grandson, and I'm living in peace in this country. And he would have been a Republican man himself. And but it's happened in my lifetime. And it's wonderful to know that there's a generation of children growing up in Ireland that know nothing about what went on in those troubles, and now learn it in history books rather than in real life experiences coming into their sitting room. But it started by listening, and that's the challenge for communities all across America, to start listening, but deeply listening to each other, without having to say, because I'm listening, it means I'm in agreement. It doesn't mean that. So can we meet then and find a way forward?
Derek, thank you. We have to stop because we have to go to our meeting.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for doing this.